Good morning, everyone. Peace builders are not known for their being on time. So we're going to start, and I know people are still trickling in for registration. My name is Liz Hume. I'm the Executive Director at the Alliance for Peace Building. We're so thankful you're here in person, and we know we have huge numbers online too. So a big hello to wherever you are in the world watching and participating in PeaceCon. We love our USIP Day partnership. We love it. But it's a little more formal, right? So this is a little more informal. Let your hair down, ask hard questions, make sure these sessions are interactive. You can put your feet up. It's just a little bit more informal. So we encourage you to really embrace that. We're also going to talk a lot about conflict here in the United States. There's some sensitivities of that at USIP, given their charter is for international, but we're not shying away from that today. So we want to talk about conflict that's happening here in the U.S. in democracies. I'm looking at you, Helena. You and I, your last conference for Build Up was in Chemnitz, Germany. It was about 2 years ago. Significant conflict in Germany. We just saw the elections right there where the AfD was elected for the first time. So that's something that I know I hope we get to as well. It's not lost on me today that it's September 11th, and you don't have to be American to, this is a pretty sacred day in the US. If you were of an age that you could remember, you know where you were. I was in Kosovo. I had been there, I was serving in the peacekeeping mission in Bosnia and Kosovo right after the wars there. I also, I worked for a large law firm in the World Trade Center for 2 years. It's not lost on us that, and one of the attacks happened just a few miles away from here. It's a hard thing to talk about, given where we are in the world. And I actually even talked to Alan, our board chair this morning, saying, how do we talk about this? And one of the things that we discussed is that the 1990s, and there were terrible things that happened in the 1990s. I mean, I was sitting in Bosnia and Kosovo and Rwanda, but for that period of time, conflict was at its lowest levels. The Cold War was over. I mean, we had peace agreements. I was working in a peacekeeping mission. We haven't had, I think since 2014, there has not been a new UN peacekeeping mission. So that moment kind of started, the war in Iraq, and we've seen this ticking up of conflict. We talked about it yesterday, 2018, record-breaking conflict levels. So, but we also know that many of you are living conflict every day. And so we don't want to take that away from that, but recognize this very solemn day in the United States and how it started a change in how we are living globally now. Okay, so today we really wanted to talk about trust building. It's the antidote to conflict. We all say it. What does it mean? What does it mean? What's working? What's not working? We are not doing a good job of, we're talking the talk about trust building. We got to do it. We have to do it. Declining social cohesion. But what does that mean? And are we doing what we need to do? Do we need to change? That goes back to what President McAlee said yesterday. We have to, figure out what, look inside ourselves. So that's really what we're talking about today. And we'll also be having a very critical session at the end of the day on Israel-Palestine. So I encourage you all to be there for that as well. Okay, I want to, when we talk about trust building, I want to give you an example of what it is to me. My family owns a house in West Virginia. My mom's whole family is from West Virginia. I was actually born in Ohio, so I have a lot of connection to those areas. And last spring, there were significant fires on the border of Virginia and into West Virginia in the Panhandle. And these areas are, for those of you who don't know, they're rural, there's a lot of poverty. A lot of people from DC have moved out there during COVID. It's a mix of an area. So these fires were really, really bad and destroying homes. And this is the Facebook page that popped up. Today is one of those days. Huge interface wildfires have ravaged and continue to ravage large tracts of land, destroying everything in its path across the Panhandle. There have been structure fires and other emergencies, and he continues on. But in the context of how spread thin our Eastern Panhandle departments are right now, the fact that each and every call continues to be answered is a testament to a word we call sacrifice. The effects are far-reaching. I heard a volunteer on one of the fires crackle a message over the radio. He is supposed to be going to work right now. And he thought, wow, that guy is going to give paid hours up to help his neighbor. His family might have to buy a few less groceries. And he goes on and on and on about the trickle effect of this one, happens because this person isn't going to be able to go to his job. So the Facebook page is a bit long, but he continues on to say, and the trickle down goes on and on and on. Pray for our firefighters, pray for our communities, and if you're not the praying kind and you've made it to the end of this post with empathy and pride in your heart for the supporting communities, then welcome aboard. Our worlds are not so far apart. I don't know this person. I've actually been trying to look for this person. His name is Andrew Arnold. Then welcome aboard. Our worlds are not so far apart, and empathy. That's trust building. That's building social cohesion. So that, I think, is a really important message to take forward. And what President McAleese talked about yesterday, looking inside ourselves, our tone, how we talk to each other, our own empathy. Peace building starts at home. So with that, we have an incredible session for you today. And I am so excited to welcome our board chair, Alan. I'm looking for Alan. Alan Fitz. You heard him yesterday. He is a treasured board member, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Alan.
Good morning, everyone. Great to see you all this morning. I hope you all enjoyed our programming yesterday, and so welcome to day 2 of PeaceCon. My name is Alan Fitz. I have the honor of serving as the chairman of the Alliance for Peace Building Board of Directors. But this morning, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Kirsty Graham, the U.S. CEO of Edelman. For those of you who may not know, Edelman is a global communications giant that partners with businesses and organizations alike to evolve, promote, and protect their brands and reputations. But for more than 20 years, Edelman has studied the influence of trust in government, media, business, and NGOs through its trust and credibility survey, the Edelman Trust Barometer. This research provides real-world insights that shape conversation and inform leadership, strategy, policy, and sustained action across institutions, and this is what we're going to be discussing today. As Edelman's U.S. CEO, Kirsty leads the company's efforts to advise and counsel global business leaders on multi-stakeholder communication strategies. Prior to Edelman, Kirsty spent 10 years at Pfizer, where she provided senior policy and communications counsel to the executive team there. In addition to being a communications expert, she has a broad array of regulatory and diplomatic experience on Capitol Hill in a variety of roles, including New Zealand's Deputy Ambassador to the United Nations. Today, she'll be taking us through some of the findings of the Edelman Trust Barometer, and then we'll have some time to discuss what that means for the peace building field. She's going to present some data for us to begin. We'll have a short talk afterwards, and then we'll open it up for questions. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kirsty. Apologies.
No, okay, perfect. So I was just saying, when the 23rd anniversary of September 11, it also takes me back to a lot of the work I did in the UN, and I'm thrilled to be here to talk to you today because I think the work that you are all doing is so incredibly important and so incredibly important right now. I know that you're talking about social cohesion and how do we get greater harmony here and internationally. Trust is a massive part of that conversation. And what I'm going to show you today is some data points that I think just give a very interesting stock take of where we are from a societal point of view, what drives trust, and what happens when you don't have trust, and what do we do with that? So let me start by taking you through some data. So as Alan said, we have been doing this for 24 years. It's the biggest study of institutional trust in the world. We study these 4 institutions that Alan referenced, NGOs, government, media, and business. We do it in 28 countries, and as you can see, it's 32,000 respondents. It will give you some data points for what we think of as the mega trends, and then also during the pandemic, we did some special reports. We thought there were so many interesting things happening in society and the nexus across the institutions that we also did a number of special reports. So we now do trust in the workplace, we do trust in health, we do a special survey on climate. Some of those data points I've infused in here where I want you to see something that I think is interesting to the macro trends. Every year we sit in the room, we look at the data and we say, okay, what are we seeing here? And over the course of these 24 years, I think the pieces that you see in bold are really these 7 trends that have started to become much bigger in the findings. So in 2005, we started to see a shift from authorities to people like me, to peers. Keep that in your head as we go through the data. In 2006, we saw more of this, a person like me, being a credible spokesperson. In 2016, we started to see a bigger difference in the mass class divide. And what do I mean by that? The difference between people's trust in institutions, between high income and low income. The battle for truth, 2018. Then we went to 2021, a fascinating time. For the first time we've done this research, business became the most trusted institution. Think about that time. We were 1 year into the pandemic. It was a pretty extraordinary time, but trust in business really accelerated and kind of hasn't moved. Then we saw navigating a polarized world. And this year, we've put all of that together and said, actually, we're at a pretty important pivot point when you look at adoption of innovation. How all these themes come together and we think about the complexity of the world's challenges and the polarization and what's happening in innovation adoption. So just a little data point on economic performance, but I think this is just a fascinating slide in terms of what has happened for trust scores. Now remember, these are across 4 institutions. So how do people in these countries feel about the trust levels in those institutions? What you see is a marked difference between trust in developing countries versus trust in developed countries. In fact, if red is not trusted, we don't have a single G7 country that is in the trusted category. You could think about systems of government, you could think about growth rates, because many of those in the cobalt blue have higher growth rates, but there's something very interesting going on here. And look at some of these areas of huge change. This was taken before the UK election, but at that point, the UK was the lowest it's ever been, down 4 points. But you can see a number of countries have had significant change. When we then think of what's happening in this mass class divide, I think this is hugely important, and I think really important when we talk about peace and we talk about social cohesion. But look at this mass class divide. This is what we mean by that is the difference between how high income versus low income feel about those 4 institutions. And there is this incredible, of the 28 countries, we surveyed, now 23 of them have a double-digit gap between high income and low income and how they feel about those institutions. And if you look to the right-hand side, some of these are really significant moves. So greatest trust and equality. There isn't a continent that isn't represented here. You know, Thailand, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Colombia, Germany. This is where we have these big fault lines. And I think this plays into the conversation we're going to have around peace. You saw in 2005 that we talked about the dispersion of authority. How do people feel about leaders? Well, one of the interesting things we've seen in when we look across 10 years is a drop in trust in companies that are headquartered in the global powers. So what we also know is that the world has changed. We've gone to a multipolar world. There are some big shifts in economic power, who has growth, the conversations that we see playing out in the UN and in various conflicts around the world. But when you look at it through the corporate lens, it's fascinating that trust in these three, in China, US, and UK, has all declined in the last 10 years. China was 30% trust, but that's actually gone down 3 points. If you look at the US and the UK, those are big drops, down 9 and down 11. And I think there is a quite interesting story in here also. When you look on China, look at Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia's trust in China has gone up 14. So there are some very interesting geopolitical things coming through here. Similarly, if you look at trust in companies headquartered in the US, look at Europe. Europe has gone into the negative, into the not trusting, and it's gone down 8 points. Similarly, how Europe feels about companies headquartered in the UK. So you see there's a bunch of very interesting things taking place in geopolitics. Then you think about the institutional leaders we're talking about. This just speaks to the whole issue around misinformation, but 63% of people believe that government leaders are purposely trying to mislead them or exaggerating. That's a global finding. 63% of people think that about government leaders. 61% think about that for business leaders, and 64% think that about journalists. And this is the one where we see the biggest increase of 3 years. Now, actually, the US data is even more interesting because trust in government leaders is, the people who believe that they're being misled by government is 70%. So we have some challenges here. And when you think about people not knowing where to go for trust, where they go for information, the sense of vulnerability, what are people worried about? Personal economic fears are significant globally. People are concerned about job loss. They're concerned about inflation. But I think what's also very interesting here is when you think about the existential societal issues, and these are ones that we track each year, climate change, hacking, nuclear war, look at the +6 on the information war. Who do I trust? How do I know this information's true? So this, I think, is a big part of the conversation when we think about rebuilding trust and we think about peace. This is a fascinating slide about the dispersion of authority. When we ask people, who did they believe to tell them the truth about new technologies and innovations? Reassuring to see scientists up there. But look who equals the same amount. Someone like me. So this sense of who is it that I go to is really, really important. And when we talk later about how you influence and how you reach people, keep in mind this piece about someone like me, because trust has really moved local. People are thinking, who is it I interact with? Do I trust them? And to give you a sense of what this looks like, how this shows up, how this manifests itself. This is one when I was running the health practice. I couldn't believe this, but I thought it was so profoundly important when we were talking to people in the healthcare space. Almost 50% of people between 18 and 34 believe that they can be as informed as their doctor by doing their own research. That's staggering. But it also speaks to where people are going for information. And one of the things we've been sort of counseling people on is you can't fight this. We can't put the genie back in the bottle. So you've got to think about, where is your message resonating? Where are you showing up? Who are you talking to? But this just shows what's happened with that dispersion of authority and my desire to see someone telling me something who is like me. Something else that's been very interesting that really accelerated during the pandemic was, I don't know who to go to in terms of trustworthy information or who I trust. The role of the employer. People trust their employer more than they trust any of those institutions. And I think there was something that was going on during COVID in terms of isolation, in terms of proximity, in terms of, for those who were actually working at home, who weren't in a manufacturing plant or were in their own setting, this sense of my employer took on a life of its own, and that has not changed. So people really are leaning into the role of their employer as somebody they trust. So we talked about polarization. This is also sobering data. We said, okay, what do we mean by polarization? We're not going to agree on everything. My country is divided. But this point around entrenchment, whether those divisions can be overcome. Can we actually have a civil conversation if we don't agree? Look at up the top. In the severely polarized, you have Argentina, Colombia, US, South Africa, Spain, Sweden. And then in that stripe bar, you have a number of other countries at risk of severe polarization. So this is the sense, you say this, I'm going to say that. That is a really alarming, I think, state of where we are, and I think that also plays into the issues you are discussing. How does this manifest itself? This is another slide that I found unbelievably depressing and sobering. When we asked people, if someone disagrees with my point of view, how likely am I to help them? 30%. How likely am I to be willing to live in the same neighborhood? 20%. Be willing to have them as a co-worker? 20%. These are global findings. So when we talk about, I loved Liz, what you read out on that post, but this to me is the manifestation of where that polarization is taking us. And it's not actually just around those issues, we're also seeing it in the business world. The sense of 60% of respondents saying they're going to buy, choose, or avoid brands based on their politics. So let's talk a little bit about the media landscape. So here we have a 10-year trend. A couple of things to notice here. One, media has always been largely in the red, or certainly not in the cobalt, in the trusted space. Second of all, it's pretty much flatlined. And thirdly, although it's not on this slide, earlier in the year we looked at the 4 institutions and whether people thought they were playing a unifying or a divisive role in society. Government and media were considered to be playing a divisive role, pushing people to extremes. Thinking about, how do I get clicks, how do I get votes, definitely shifting it more to the sides. And here is, when you look at what's happened in this, think of 4 different types of media. Think of search engines, traditional media, owned, social. The interesting story is social media, continuously not trusted, continuing to go down. What is the offset here is in the search engines, and I think a particularly interesting sort of click down here is that Gen Z, yes, they're spending a lot of time on TikTok, they're spending a lot of time on social media, but this is also a generation that goes then to the search engine to check if the information is true. So think of this not in a linear way, but as a circle when you think about the media landscape. I mentioned before the power of employers as being the most trusted, but also the most trusted in terms of where I get my information. People really leaning in. It puts an enormous responsibility on employers, but I think it's also an opportunity when you think about channels and how to reach people. People are trusting their employer. In fact, they're trusting information from their employer more than they are from the media or more than they are from their government. Growing role for business. I say this because I think one of the points we're going to make at the end of this is around the need for the institutions to work together. But during the pandemic, what we saw for the first time was business becoming the most trusted institution. And that has not changed, but it is a 10-year change in terms of the trusting in business from 2014 to 2024. And the flip side of that is trust in government. And I think when you go back to the start of the pandemic, there was this enormous surge in trust in government at the very start, and then it cratered. I think it cratered with expectations, it cratered with what people saw as the delivery or the communication. And there's really these big deltas, at least 10 points between government and business. And remember, this is global. This one I think is very interesting. So we look at the competence and the ethics of institutions, and we think of where do they all map. So NGOs here, definitely seen in the ethical axis, less favorable in terms of the competency, what we describe as getting things done. Business is almost seen as ethical as NGOs, but more competent. But perhaps these 2 points that I made earlier around the divisive element, the role that institutions are playing, both government and media in the quadrant where you do not want to be. Not competent, not ethical. So just to double click on what this means for innovation and what we see happening in trust, almost the implications of some of these trust data points for innovation. Innovation, when you think about all the things that are confronting the world, plays an incredibly important role if we're going to start solving some of these things, plus the pace of innovation. But there are some watch outs here. So even though a sector may be trusted, the innovation that comes from that sector can't be assumed to share the same trust scores. We ask people about green energy, about AI, gene-based medicine, GMOs. Some big gaps between how they feel about the sector versus how they feel about the innovation. And I think in here there's also a very important communications lesson. And you see these big question marks still on AI, a 26 gap between how people feel they trust technology, but they have question marks around AI. Business is the most trusted of the institutions to bring innovation to society. The thing that I think is a real watch out here is A, the role of the media. People don't trust the media in terms of innovation, but also, and it comes back to that point we made earlier, a big trust deficit or a gap between how high and low income people feel about trust and innovation. And that, I think, is really important in terms of bringing me on the journey. I'll show you a bit more on this. Sobering, and particularly in Western democracies, the resistance to innovation is political. If you look at how people line up, people who are identified as being right-leaning or left-leaning, there's far greater resistance to innovation on the right than on the left. And I think what's really interesting here is look at the US. That is a 53 for the right, 12 for the left. So big gaps. Interestingly, if you go to the other end of the chart, you see the reverse in places like Argentina, Malaysia, Mexico, Nigeria. So there is a sense of different things happening in different parts of the world. But if you don't manage innovation in the right way, there are bigger fallouts. If people feel that innovation is being poorly managed, they are more likely to believe that technology is leaving me behind. They're also more likely to believe my society or our society is changing too quickly. And to take that further, when that happens, people also start to think about the role of capitalism. So this sense of innovation, and when I think of some of the business companies we work with, this sense of what do you have to do to bring me on this journey? It's not enough to say this innovation is going to be great for you. You have to show someone how. A data point, I've only got about 4 more slides, I think, but just to say here, this is really interesting. Over 10 years, we have seen a 15-point rise in people saying they want institutions to partner. They really want business and government to come together. And those are some big increases that you see circled. Nearly everyone saying, if business partners with government, I trust innovation more. Point I made about bring me on the journey. People are more likely to embrace an innovation consistently, if you look at where the black dots have moved, if I have confidence that this innovation is going to lead to a better future. So it's not just enough to explain this innovation in its small contribution, it's put it in the context of societal benefit. Last slide. What do we conclude from all of this? First of all, there is a need, I think, for institutions to come together, whether it's business, whether it's NGOs, whether it's government. The scale of the challenges we now have require institutions to partner. That is what people are saying they want. Secondly, give me some control over the future. I'm feeling that the pace of these things is so great, you need to bring me with you. And that, I think, is that piece also around someone like me, that dispersion of authority. I need someone I can identify with to be able to embrace this. Thirdly, when you think of that data point on trusted information, how people are feeling about who do they go to, being the provider of trusted, credible information, of facts, because I think in this journey we've been on, we have also lost a sense of respect for facts. This is a really important point. And as an employer, whatever the scale of your operation, your own people are seeing you as the most trusted in this space. And then fourthly, we need to think about this in terms of what is polarization, what is politicization, what has that done for our policy issues, for innovation, and the world we live in? We need to come back to rebuilding trust because the stakes are so incredibly high. I'm going to stop at that. I know, Alan, we're going to have a conversation, but that is the summary of the data from this year.
Thank you so much. Fascinating findings. Some really resonated. Some I found downright frightening. I actually want to call out a couple of them that we'll get to, but just ones that really stuck out. I think the sort of decline in media, the distrust of media was fascinating, especially in traditional media, and really sort of makes me think about what channels we need to be using in order to get our messages across. The experts versus someone like me, I find fascinating. The idea that people are more likely to accept information from someone who is either close or who they can relate to. People that think that they can easily know as much as their doctor. And then the neighbors statistic as well, which really sort of speaks to the social cohesion point. This idea that people are less likely or have a declining sense that they would even want to live next to or help someone who disagrees with them. That is sort of shocking to me. So I think we will get into all of that and more. We also will open up this session to questions at the end, so please start thinking through anything that you'd like to ask. But all of this, I think, is incredibly relevant to this community. And I sort of think of it in a little bit in two buckets. One, obviously this decline of trust lays at the root of so many causes of conflict. And so we really need to address some of these issues of distrust if we're going to sort of crack the nut of conflict. But then really then, how do we move forward? How do we tell our stories? And how do we evangelize the causes that are dear to us and that are part of the peace building field, both in terms of what voices we use, what channels we go through, and then what partners we choose to partner with, because clearly that's a key finding. So I thought I would start though by asking you to help us to apply these findings to the peace building field. All of us here, I think, rely on or are working towards some sense of social cohesion. That is a core part and a core tool to what we're trying to do, a sense of community. So what do these findings mean? Help me bridge these findings to the world of conflict and peace building.
Yeah. So I do think they're highly relevant to peace building writ large. And I think that's partly because there is a role that we all need to play with these institutions, but I also think, and it goes right back to how you introduced the session, Liz, around the role for individuals. And I think peace building right now, when you think of the conflicts happening around the world, is so tense and difficult when there are divisions within countries about how to respond to particular issues. So I think we have to have much more open conversations about what those issues are. I was texting with my aunt this morning, who is in the peace building community in New Zealand. And I said, what would you say? And she said, I think we've lost the ability to have, she said, we need to do more to educate at the community level. So her point was that in a world of sound bites, of social media, of clickbait, that some of the issues we're dealing with are so complicated, and we need to take the time to actually explain, to understand different perspectives, but to do that at a community level so that the policy issues are better understood. I thought that was a really interesting insight that I know you are all probably deep in that in the worlds you live in, but that is so incredibly important. I think when you look at the four big institutions, I also think there's working with government, this sense of partnership, that these issues are so large that you need to be working with everybody. And to your point, Alan, this sense of a person like me, we saw it in COVID, we saw it in the vaccine conversations particularly, but the sense of don't fight that dispersion of authority, but certainly think about where you are. Who are you communicating with and how? And I think another piece in this is that the stakeholder environment, when I think about what the world looked like when I was at the UN or in 2019, pre-COVID, I think a lot of things were in much more discrete silos. When you think about peace building now, I think those silos have come together, right? So you can't isolate climate change issues from health issues, from what that will mean for politics. I remember climate change being a debate in the Security Council, and it was seen as a huge breakthrough, that climate change is going to have security implications. So the sense of dot connecting, of working across institutions and working across issues, I think is really important, as well as how you are calling others to account on the trust piece.
So everyone here is working towards change in one manner or another. But in the worldview that you have laid out, it's clear that building consensus is getting tougher and tougher. Yeah. People are increasingly polarized. There's declining trust. People are reticent to help each other. How does change happen in an environment like that? And then are these trends reversible? Is this something that we're going to keep seeing where the gaps widen, or is this something that we could see an ebb and a flow to?
Yeah. So I'm a glass half full person, and I'm going to go back to that piece this morning because it gave me goosebumps. And I thought this is so important because there are institutional things that we need to do to change, but I think there are many pieces at an individual level. Very practical things like, where are we getting our information? Are we talking to a wide range of people? It is entirely possible to disagree with someone but still have a civil conversation. I think when you look at the sense of those four institutions and who's playing a divisive role versus unifying, my own view is that a lot of the world craves a bit more of a conversation around the middle, that the business models in media, that some of the conversations we've seen in government have been about the edges as opposed to what brings us together. I do believe that we're going to see that will come back. I think COVID was also a massive, I think we've got a COVID hangover or the legacy from COVID, I think, is profound. I think it's profound from a mental health aspect. I think it's profound in terms of the isolation that people felt. And I think it's profound in terms of people being much more in a bubble of someone like me. And so I hope people continue to travel. I hope people continue to go out and socialize. Someone said to me, more FaceTime, less FaceTime, right? I thought that was a really interesting observation. And I thought we have to make sure that we are engaged in our communities, even when we disagree. Because like you, I found that so shocking. And yet I go back to the example Liz gave, and I thought everybody in this room would probably have felt good about that. I think ultimately humans want that. You think of, when you see, coming back to social media, when something good happens in the world, it gets spread unbelievably, whether it's a piece of sportsmanship, whether it's an animal being saved. We have to remind ourselves that humans are intrinsically good, and we have got to double down on that to bring people with us. That's why I think this conversation is both an institutional conversation, and it's then what can I do at an individual level to make this better?
So I want to talk a little bit about communication, both in terms of how people are getting their information. I think there were trends that were occurring even pre-COVID that COVID probably accelerated in terms of how people were receiving information, what sources they were going to, and then ultimately who they decided to trust information with. I found the statistics that you had about the equal or lower trust in experts going forward. And again, I keep coming back to this idea that people are more likely to accept information from someone that they find on the internet than someone who's an expert. Going back to your Pfizer days, I am reminded of during COVID, there was a sort of step back from the Anthony Fauci's of the world and a step into the Travis Kelce's of the world to go and push people to get vaccinated, because that's who was resonating. Someone, for certain demographics, that was who people could accept information from versus an expert who might have an agenda, which I find fascinating. So how should the nonprofit world adapt in order to build support, sell their case, get their story across? Is this a sort of and model, or is this a switch that we should be pushing into different voices, different channels?
Yeah. So I think the takeaways from the data I showed, and when you think of what we've all lived over the last since 2019, I think there are some massive communication takeaways, irrespective of whether you are a leader, which institution you're part of. But the sense that communication is so incredibly important. You need to probably index more on communication, over-communicate. Don't assume, when you look at innovation, don't assume that saying something is good is going to bring people with you. And I think when we look at that mass class divide and the sense of high income versus low income, I think we've probably done a disservice collectively in telling people something is good for them, as opposed to hearing questions, having a thoughtful conversation, and showing people, doubling down on the reasons to believe. I think there is a massive education part in this. I think from a where you show up piece, have a broader sense of your stakeholders. Think about how those interconnected pieces work. Think about Gen Z. I think it's fascinating that they're, two kids in that age bracket who, they are on TikTok, but they're also wised up to going and doing their own checking. I don't think we can fight this dispersion of authority, but I think the communication lesson is have a bigger sense of your stakeholders. Your message may not change, but just as you gave that example on Travis Kelce, thinking about, okay, who is influential and what is the mode that is the best delivery? So we had an example of a client recently, and it struck me that everything they were talking about doing was Wall Street Journal, FT, New York Times. No. And they said, are you going to suggest we need to be on TikTok? Yes. Yes. So your message doesn't change, but where you are showing up, I think irrespective, but I think particularly the role for NGOs right now, broaden that constituency. People want partnership. Make sure you're educating to bring people with you and make sure you're doing it with others.
Find ways to show up in search engines.
Right, right.
I want to ask one other question about partnerships, which I found the information that you presented about people have a higher propensity to trust in something if it's coming from a sort of collaboration or more than one source, particularly in the example that you gave of business and government. But I suspect that probably also applies to NGOs working with business, NGOs working with government, some other combination of those. How should the peace building field, how should NGOs think about partnership going forward as a sort of multiplying effect?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical because I think when you look at the deficit in trust overall and you see how much people put more trust when they believe there is partnership, that sense of, I think people are cynical about any particular institution, any particular organization pushing something that they think, okay, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? But if they see others as part of that solution, then there's a sort of like, oh, okay, well, that is interesting. So I think there's a credibility piece that comes with it. I think there's also a recognition of the complexity. You know, if you just think of the issues that we're dealing with now, how no institution, be it an NGO, a government, or even an employer, no institution can actually do it on their own. So I think there's also a respect that comes from the realization of the moment that we're in. And I also think that it gives what underlies all of this, which is making sure that you are listening to a diversity of voices, that we all come with our own sense of what is going to make something work, but actually that going right back to the data point of listening to someone with a different view, wanting to work, wanting to have them as a neighbor, helping, I think we have to be physically out there in the community and hearing different viewpoints, because that is key to partnership and to changing and to building back trust.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I want to talk about what this means for leadership in terms of leadership styles, how both organizations but also individual leaders need to adapt and learn from the trends that you outlined. How should we shift our focus, and how do we change our communications?
So I love that question because if I had more time, I'd love to do some research on leadership, what we saw in the pandemic, and what conclusions we make from some of that. And I think that's irrespective of whether someone's a politician, in the media. I think a word that Liz used really jumps out at me, which was empathy. I think that what we saw in that period of time was, I want to hear from you more often. You need to be there with me, communicate. I think there was also, and this is from our health research that I spent quite a lot of time on, I don't mind if you change your guidance, just tell me that you're changing your guidance and tell me why. And I think we saw that in many different countries around the world of, whether it was masking, whether it was how many meters, social distancing, people were much more likely to change their behavior if they saw someone saying, I said this last week, we've now got new data, and what we're saying is this. So I think a sense of vulnerability and honesty in leadership around, I have changed my advice, or I am changing what I'm asking you to do because. So again, that bringing people with you. I think we also saw much more of leaders. Think about all the Zoom and Teams meetings you've been on when you suddenly realize that the people you work with, you saw their pets, you saw their living room, you probably saw some things you didn't want to see. You really had a much better sense of the whole person. I think that has been a pivotal change in leadership. I don't think that will go away. I think people actually liked having a better sense of what is the totality of a personality and and of leadership. I think that the communication landscape became much more important, and as part of that, not just what you're saying, but how you're saying it, and then did you do it? So when you think about trust, I think a huge amount of trust comes from, you said that, did you actually do it? And I think in all the data that we've seen from health, from trust in the workplace, I want to see you actually walk the talk, really, really important. And then I think we've all got examples of leaders that we saw who really came through this well because there was a degree of self-effacement. There was a recognition that we hadn't lived through something of this scale before. And I remember interviewing a panel of business leaders, and one was from an airline. And I said, so how have you thought about leadership? And he said, I had moments when I just was terrified. He said, it's not often you lose 90% of your business overnight. And he said, but what it made me think about was what's really important and what about my people? And I remember that because he didn't go to talking about his planes and their routes around the world. It was, what about my people? And so I think that irrespective of where the leader comes from, that sense of did they value the right things and did they follow through?
Thank you. I'm going to open it up for questions now from the audience. So please raise your hand. We have microphones on the sides, actually.
I'll get us started. Hi, I'm Judy Dunbar, and for today I'm coming from the Alliance for Peace Building, but I work in the private sector in my day job, and there's so very much I could talk to you about for this, and thank you so much for coming. I think the thing I'd be curious about is as we look at business, and business beginning to engage on social issues. I think 5 years ago, you saw business really leaning in on these issues over the course of the pandemic, and then in the U.S. in the aftermath of George Floyd. I think now you're seeing business leaders seeing more risk to upside, perhaps, in some sectors on engaging these issues. How do you talk to business leaders about engaging on these issues, given the risk aversion in the sector?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's been a lot of our work in the last few years. I think probably increasingly right now, when you think of companies or brands who've found themselves in headlines, I think that it's a bit like building trust with individuals. I think there has to be consistency in behavior. I think it has to be tied to company values. I think it's super important that companies understand where their stakeholders are. And sometimes, and we're really seeing this now when we think about the role of employers, understanding where your employees are on an issue, right? I think so that consistency, the values base, the where are my stakeholders become really important. There was something else you made me think of, but it's gone, but it was around the social issues. Oh, I was going to say that I think this also shows up differently in different parts of the world. So if I think of ESG issues, for example, and some of the debates here or some of the debates in the West, and yet when I look at Europe, I think, okay, they're not backing away from some of these things. Part of that is because of the regulatory environment, right? Part of that is because of compulsory disclosures. So I think the regulatory environment also plays a role in this. And then a lot of companies we talk to are working with, they aren't necessarily backing off action, but they're thinking about how they talk about it. So again, I think the communication piece becomes an important factor. Yeah.
I'm gonna go to that side.
I was going to run these around the room, but you guys are very enterprising, got up, so I
Stacia George, I'm an independent consultant, and this is completely fascinating. Previously with the Carter Center, and if people are interested in looking at these issues of how to address polarization at home, they've been working hard on that to bridge the right and the left divide, and there's a great panel tomorrow morning on that I recommend going to, of someone on the right from Florida and someone from the left in Arizona, and how they're working on this. So how does that work on the ground? But the question I have is, we're sitting in a university institution, And given the events, particularly in the U.S., where you're seeing lots of divides even within institutions of higher learning, what findings do you have, or what have you seen in terms of the trust of higher learning institutions, both external audiences towards them, but also within them as well? And what can we take away from that?
I love the Carter Center reference. Actually, one of the most rewarding pieces of work I ever did was taking a trip with the Carter Center, actually with Pfizer, to Ethiopia back a few years ago. Incredible contribution. So I think actually some of the lessons are very similar to the first question in terms of, I think people have seen a lot of missteps in this space or things that probably haven't gone as well. I think part of that has been around how quickly you know what's going on or quickly you know how your stakeholders feel. I think there is a need to consider all your stakeholders. And then I do think there is a need for a conversation around tougher issues. And I noticed that you're having a conversation this afternoon on Israel, Gaza. I think that is a perfect example of, when I said that peace is hard, and I spent some time on this issue at the UN, there's a reason why this is hard. And we have to, I think, come to that as individuals prepared to hear the other side. And so I think, and I spent a lot of time in student politics actually back in the day in New Zealand. I think, you want institutions to have free speech, but I also think you have to have a culture of respect. So I think it's many of those issues we talked about that apply in the business community are the same in higher ed.
Yeah, hi, my name is Antti Pentikäinen, and I have a professorship here at Carter School, and I run an NGO called Think Peace, and I used to be an advisor for Alliance for Peace Building as well. But so in this debate or storm, there is the foam and the undercurrent and the deep waters, and I'd like to a little bit look into the deep waters and take two perspectives. One is dealing with the past, another one is the neuroscience perspective on why this happens. This may sound a little provocative, but looking into dealing with the past, some of the founding fathers in our current standards are child abusers. If you think of Jefferson and what was going on with Sally Cummings. This country used to be just a couple of decades before South Africa, a similar apartheid country, but pretends it never existed, or doesn't want to discuss what it did for its original people, while pretending to be the thought leader in the world. If you look from the neuroscience perspective, just coming back, it's not a surprise that democracy doesn't function if you're not willing to face that and learn from it and find something that's better. And from the neuroscience perspective, we do know that 7 generations we hold in our DNA and epigenetics, war trauma, and this country is filled with that. So I just wanted to kind of ask your opinion on these really deep waters and how they must be taken into account.
I wasn't sure I got the tail end of the question, but I will make some comments on, I think any country that's had a difficult past or has had issues, or actually even think about community level issues. I think from my time in the UN on some of these issues, institutions or countries or communities that, if you think of trust and reconciliation work, I think that's incredibly important. I think a huge amount of, and I'm not necessarily thinking of the specifics you raised, but I'm just thinking in terms of trust building, in terms of peace building, a lot can brew in people if they don't feel like they've had a chance to say what they believe happened and how that impacted them. And so I think of some of this when you think about global conflict, I almost think of it as, how does the individual respond? How do we all feel when we think we haven't been listened to, or something that happened to us hasn't been either understood or given some airing? So I do think that trust and reconciliation processes are incredibly important if you want to build trust.
Hello, Preston Lindsay. I've been working recently with a depolarization grassroots community over in California.
Can you?
Sorry, soft-spoken. Preston Lindsay. I've been working with the grassroots depolarization committee out in California most recently. And one of the things that we've been working on that we thought that when we were gathering everyone together, everyone kind of thought that they wanted to discuss these things, right? And the more work we engaged in, the more we realized people didn't know how to listen to each other. They just basic things without othering each other in their speech, or there's lots of different ways that happens. But one of the numbers that you presented here on trust in scientists versus trust in someone like them, like, I'm curious, in the framing context of communication strategies between disparate peoples, whether there was anything mirrored in the numbers for, like, for example, were there political disparities or polarization correlated with that trust in scientists versus trust in someone like me?
So I can't give you the exact breakdown on that, but I can give you a data point that I think is relevant, which is not in here. But in the health survey, and actually I think it was in another one we did just a few months ago, there was, on the one hand, I am trusting scientists, I'm trusting technical experts. But the next question was, but I don't believe they talk to me in a way that I can understand. So the sense of, and it's not exactly the same as a person like me, right? But I think there is an interesting communication strategy lesson from that, which is, and maybe we saw it during COVID as well, but being prepared. Oh, the other data point that is relevant in there was allow me to ask questions. So the sense of just telling me that this is right without necessarily giving me a proper explanation or giving me the respect. You might think it's a stupid question, but give me the respect to be able to ask it and to have it answered. So that was a big data point in the health survey, but I think it applies to tech. I think it applies to everything we saw and hear around how you talk to me. Yep.
Thank you. So humanization.
Yeah, yeah.
Hello, Pablo Molina with Peace News. You've spoken to how there's a decreased willingness to engage with people, work with them, live near them, if there is a disagreement over some sort of issue. I'm interested if Edelman inquired further into whether the perceived importance of the issue at hand affects that willingness at all. Say, do people care more about disagreements over LGBTQ rights than marginal tax brackets, and if that changed the willingness at all? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. The answer is no. So we didn't break it down. We didn't ask specifics. I think it would be really interesting. I think that's a really thoughtful question. No, we didn't. But we're actually in the throes now of thinking about our survey, our questions for next year. And we are thinking about the polarization piece and the issues. The thing that we also have to be mindful of when we write the survey, though, is it's got to be globally relevant. So some of these issues we are talking about are very marked here and here right now. In a Kenya or a Russia or an Indonesia, they might show up differently. So we're always trying to think about, are we asking questions that are globally relevant? Yep.
Can I ask a very quick follow-up?
Yeah.
Do you think that puts you might have to put a little asterisk next to the results to that question, is because people might have interpreted what you meant by issue slightly differently?
I would ask our research team that, but I think in terms of just measuring trust overall, I think it's a fascinating and somewhat devastating data point that people would put those two things together. Like, if you don't agree with me, this is how it shows up for me in these areas. Yeah.
Thank you.
Could we group just a couple of these questions together so that we do have to wrap up, but I know people really want to ask these questions.
Hi, I'm Michelle West James. I work with Peace Catalyst International, and a lot of what we do is specifically focused around Christian faith communities. But on a broader perspective, when you're talking about faith communities and the role that spirituality plays in trust and how we trust the world and our role to significance, how do we, in a way, include trust in this conversation when we're talking about, because they can very much be seen as NGOs, but they can also be seen as people of that we know, with pastors still holding a huge amount of influence, even among people who no longer attend church, pastors, rabbis, and these faith and spiritual communities. So what do you see as the role of this emerging science of spirituality and counseling and all of this in this role of trust?
So I think that's.
Why don't, let's
Yeah,
just take a
right.
couple questions. I'll make notes so we sort of take them all
Yes,
down.
excellent.
And then we'll kind of wrap with a round robin.
Okay.
Paul Quinn from Christian Aid. I'm the Global Head of Peace Building and Conflict Prevention. We're an NGO that works in 28 countries. And my question is really, this is fascinating research, and I'm wondering about the issue of partnership and the improving the kind of trust deficit. And I'm wondering if the research has given any kind of indication around when states partner together or cooperate in multilateral institutions, if that has improved the kind of dimensions and markers around trust, or in states where trust has remained relatively high, if there were kind of insights into whether this is around transparency and accountability or greater engagement between civil society and the state itself.
Great.
You have to remind me.
Yeah, no, I've got it.
Hi, I'm Marion, PhD student at the Carter School, and thank you, that was fascinating. So my question concerns non-democracies in the global south and the degree to which people can actually express their mistrust of governments, and of course governments control businesses, social media, almost everything to a large degree. That's on the one hand, but on the other hand, there is also the global to north power dynamic that leads to a lot of mistrust between citizens of the global south and those of the global north. Thank you.
My name is Clotilda Andinsa, and I come from Cameroon in Central Africa. My question relates to the work that women peace builders do on the ground, because to me it appears that there is pluralism between funders and grassroots organization. Given that peace building usually is something we need to respond to with like emergency. Where I come from, we have lived in this serious conflict for 8 years. But as women peace builders, we continue to have problems actually receiving the funding that we are supposed to get from the international funders that are meant to provide funds to kind of address this crisis. So my question is there a way that we can improve on trust building between the grassroots women peace builders and the international funders so that they can give them the trust that they need to receive the funding, and we can achieve world peace without discriminating on what we give to whom and to where? Thank you.
Okay, we'll go very quickly. Just sort of give us the gist of the questions. I'll hand the card. We can sort of touch what we can, and then we've got to wrap this up. I think we're out of time.
Yes, very quickly. In your research, was there a variance between the perception of national governance versus local/municipal governments? Was one trusted over the other? Thank you.
That's a good one. I do know the answer to that. I'm like, my head's exploding. I'm going to leave Alan to make sense of this. Yeah.
And Dana Eyre, I'm the Global Learning Officer for MNC Saatchi World Services, so I'll ask a simple question, right? Which is, those are long-term trends and global trends. That means there's got to be some deep social processes behind those trends. Can you speculate, please, and go beyond the data in terms of what is driving the trends that you have so diligently mapped out for us?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to hand this to you.
Oh, you're going to hand this to me.
Well, I mean, you can choose
great.
which ones you want.
At least you have really good writing.
Feel free to choose what you want to respond to.
Okay. I'll try and do this rapid fire, right? Spirituality, I think, is a really interesting one, because another data point that comes from the health data, but we didn't mention, was that the rise in mental health. People now think of health in a much broader sense. Mental health was the first thing they thought of, higher than physical health, which I think is really interesting. But it was also the sense of my community, and do I feel respected? Do I live in a safe space? So I think you're onto something there. It was definitely came through in the health research, and I'd be happy to share it because it was a global finding. States partnering together, role of multilaterals. Yes, yes, and yes. I'm a big believer in the multilateral system. I think it's been hugely tested right now. I do think the roles you all play on that, and there was a question, yes, from on the grassroots versus institutions. I guess what I would say is I don't want any of you to give up on both. Trust is local, 100% is coming from the local community. Those findings you have are so important, and they're arguably more influential. As we saw, trust is all around what am I experiencing. So take those experiences and keep the feet on the fire of governments, of the multilateral system, because I think those individual experiences are the only way we build trust back, because it has moved local. It is all about what I'm experiencing, where I'm living, where I'm working, and in my community. National government versus state government, yes. To that point around trust being local, people had far more trust in their local government than they had in national. So again, it's the sense of what am I experiencing? Who people tend to have, whether it was my pharmacist, my member of parliament, my congressperson, that scores higher than my view of the health system, of my government. It is all the who am I interacting with? So that power of the individual in the relationship, I think, is so important. What drives the trends? I would just say that I think we all have a responsibility to the physicality and the importance of relationships. So what is driving these trends? I think it's a combination of things that we have created in our society, and that we, when you think about the innovation story and think of the innovation journey we've been on, but that pace isn't going to change. We've got AI to think about. There are enormous benefits, but I think what we see in some of the lessons, we need to think about the role of the regulator. I think we need to think about scenario planning, what are the impacts of these issues, and we need to think about what it does for the entire thrust of your meeting, social cohesion. Because I think we sometimes think about what changes, what innovation, what conversations are doing at an individual or a product level or a breakthrough level. There's something about humans and what it is to be a human, and what society values and respects and needs, that I don't think we should ever move away from. And I think we've got a lot of data to look at and go, okay, what do we need to conclude from here to get us to a better place and to make sure that we do this in a better way?
I just want to wrap by thanking you, Kirsty. Fascinating data. I think it gave us all a lot to think about, both in terms of where some of this conflict is coming from and some of those underlying root causes, but then also how we react as leaders, as organizations, how we talk to people, how we build consensus with this information. So thank you, and thanks to all of you for your questions.
Thank you.